Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young and Ms. Coloretti, thank you for joining us today. At your nomination hearing back in March of last year, Director Young, I asked you about the economic public health justification for spending about $2 trillion in the ARP bill, which was devoted mostly to programs that had very little or nothing to do with COVID. It was really a partisan wish list, and that's how it was passed. After $4 trillion on a bipartisan basis had been passed the previous years. Well, the subsequent year has proven almost everything my Republican colleagues and I have warned about on that $2 trillion ARP bill. Just by way of a quick review, it spent $400 billion on universal government checks, $200 billion on unemployment insurance plus-ups that paid recipients more not to work than they made working, $126 billion to schools regardless of whether or not they opened, $97 billion for a bailout of union pension plans. The list goes on and on. But the results, according to the CBO, was zero job growth above and beyond what they had anticipated would occur if you never passed the ARP. Oh, and COVID cases hit record highs. Oh, and we have the highest inflation in 40 years and a whole lot more federal debt. Now, you, Ms. Young, maybe ought to get a pass on ARP. I know you supported it. I'm sure you still do. It was proposed and passed before you were confirmed. But now I'm concerned that the policies being proposed have gotten worse. I mean, ARP was counterproductive, but at least it was temporary. The so-called Build Back Better bill, as proposed, will be the single most damaging domestic legislation in generations. It's clearly an attempt to make America's middle class dependent on the government, with this free universal preschool, free government paid family leave, free government funded child care, free expanded child tax credit, expanded Obamacare subsidies, dramatic erosion of any sense of personal responsibility. Oh, and the largest tax hike since 1968, which would end up being paid for to a very large degree by American families and make the U.S. competitive. Now, I understand, thankfully, that that's at least on pause right now. I hope it actually goes on a permanent hiatus. But I want to zero in for a minute on a topic that you and the ranking member touched on briefly, and that is the provisions in the ARP that allocated $350 billion for state and local governments to spend on pretty much anything remotely related to even responding to the pandemic. And what's so shocking about that is that it occurs despite the fact that state and local governments were not in any kind of fiscal crisis in 2020 or 2021. In fact, in the aggregate, they were taking in all-time record high amounts of revenue in 2020 even. And we knew that in March of 2021. And then in 2021, they shattered the record from 2020. And the increases were quite dramatic. In 2019, state and local governments took in a little over $11 trillion. It was well over $12 trillion by 2020. It was about an 11% increase. If you look at the first 3 quarters of 2019 and compare that to the first 3 quarters of 2021, it's a 27.5% increase in the tax revenue, which was already a record high level of revenue. And so what's the effect of that been? Well, states are just swimming in cash, literally. I mean, California reported a $75 billion budget surplus for 2021. And as I predicted then, states have decided, well, they don't know really what to do with this money. So they're cutting taxes. Even virtually bankrupt Illinois has a plan for $1 billion tax cut. And the governor there says that the state's in the best fiscal position it's been in decades. State and local governments have also chosen to waste some of this money, not knowing what else to do with it. We have Syracuse, New York, spending $2 million to plant new trees, Norwich, Connecticut, building luxury apartments. The city of Chicago has decided to spend $31 million to create a guaranteed income program. It goes on and on. Again, let me just recap. ARP sent $350 billion to state and local governments after Congress had given about $650 billion of extraordinary money. This is all above and beyond what we ordinarily send to the state and the local governments. And that is all on top of absolute all-time record levels of revenue collections. So when I hear about supplementals for more domestic spending, I just want to state for the record, there is no reason that Congress should be providing still billions more on top of the 6 trillion it already did when there are hundreds of billions of dollars remain unobligated and more money than state governments have ever even seen. I do have a question I will send to you for the record regarding getting federal workers back to work in the offices to deal with Social Security, VA, and the IRS backlog. I will send that as a question for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.